Welcome to Instadeath Survivors Support Group, a podcast all about game books and the readers and writers who adore them. Today on the show, we have Samuel Isaacson. He's a busy man as an executive coach and a father of 4 young boys, but somehow he's found the time to write 4 game books since 2019. His first game book, The Altimer, was an Amazon bestseller in its category, and the series it kicked off should have its 3rd installment live by the time this episode airs. Sam, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here with you.
So first, I'd love to talk about your background in game books. It seems like most modern game book authors were childhood fans. Is that true for you too?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, I was that kid who started the fan club when I was 8 years old, something like that, maybe 9. We came up with the original title of Turn to Paragraph 400, and that was the name of our club. And yeah, we just loved not being able to complete anything despite cheating our way through every book that we had available to us, getting every library book out that had a green spine. And then when Fabled Lands came out, that was when I really threw myself right into it. And I got to the point, actually, when, the first few had come out and number 7 never seemed to appear on the shelf of my local bookshop. I was that kid that wrote a letter to the publisher saying, "When's number 7 coming?" And got a helpful reply from them saying, "It isn't." So, yeah, you can imagine my joy when I found that it actually was, however many years later it was.
So now are you the man who's writing a letter saying, when is book number 8 coming?
I'm waiting patiently this time. And there seems to be plenty of other different routes available for me at the moment to get my hit of game books. So it's all good.
As a child, what were your favorite game books?
There are a couple that stand out, and I think for everyone, then it's just, the ones that happen to be on the shelf and that I went back to again and again. Creature of Havoc. I love so much about it. I love the artwork in it and on the cover. I love the writing inside it and the way that it builds the world, which I think it does better than a lot of others. Fabled Lands always stands out as a great series. I spent a lot of time in that world when I was a teenager. And the other one that stuck with me for a long time was Legend of Zego, which I just enjoyed wandering around that castle and seeing the illustrations inside the book. Martin McKenna just really brought it to life. So, I think the monsters that are in Legend of Zego are pretty terrifying, and I've carried that with me my whole life, really.
And now you're an adult and you've written not just your own game books, but your own game book series. With this new perspective on game books, what are your all-time favorites now? Creature
of Havoc definitely does hold that special place for me. And I think if you read your way through, particularly the trilogy, you'll see a lot of the characteristics that make Creature of Havoc what it is represented there. And so some of the really annoying things that Steve Jackson did in it, like the infinite loops in which you end up just fighting the same sequence of enemies again and again. That happens in a couple of mine. I think in Portsrood Forest that might end up happening to you. And having a really really narrow one true path from the beginning to the end, that you sort of have to solve this puzzle in terms of how you're going to get back onto that path, and what decision did I miss, on my 20th choice that has led to me not getting to that optimum solution. I think there's something in that design that I've then taken and turned into my books, which quite frustrates me as a reader. It's quite interesting. I think the way that I read books and the way that I write them is quite different.
I think most or all of the books that you mentioned are fantasy books. So perhaps this is an unfair question to ask, as you've written both fantasy and sci-fi. Which is your natural preference as a reader?
As a reader, so this is interesting, actually. As a reader, up until I was in my late 20s, I would have told you I'm a fantasy fan and not a science fiction fan. And it felt unfair that I got put into the sci-fi and fantasy bracket. If I wanted to find a fantasy book in the shop, I'd have to ask them, where are your sci-fi books? And as somebody who wouldn't have described themselves as a sci-fi fan, I thought that was unfair. Stop putting me in with those nerds. And then it turns out that, the more that went into sci-fi in my 20s, I kind of discovered, oh, actually, I do like this stuff, and I have always liked it. And so in terms of where do I go most naturally as a writer? I mean, obviously I've done my trilogy in sci-fi, and then I've done my fantasy as a standalone for the moment. ... I think I write quite naturally in both, I think, but I quite liked the sci-fi version because that was a setting that I completely created. So Portsrood Forest is just really heavily stealing from traditional English fairy tales, folk tales, whereas the Entram epic, I mean, it's a future that I've created, and so I've come up with the names of places and why it is the way that it is and why the characters are the way that they are. And so I think I liked that sci-fi world because it was mine. I'll see which other genres kind of open up for me in the future, because horror is a word that keeps getting connected with my name, and I don't really like horror, but I would have said that about sci-fi as well. So watch this space. I might come up with a Western genre.
Ooh.
That's one that I feel like hasn't been done a great deal in the game book world.
Yeah.
And I might be able to contribute something. Whereas, interestingly, sci-fi has been done, and historically hasn't been done very well. And so I think I started in sci-fi just because I felt like, well, somebody has to do it well, and I wonder if I might be able to. And I think I started writing the Ultima the day that I finished reading Space Assassin, which when I read it, I thought was absolutely awful. So it's interesting that I can get inspired by something that at the time I would have said I didn't like. And then when I look at the way that the Ultima in particular is structured, I think, actually, I've probably taken more from it than I realize.
Myself as a musician, there's like a narrow band of music that I can listen to that has to be good enough to be inspiring, but not so good as to be like, well, what's the point? Anyway, so on to your books now. The third book in your series of the Entram epic, the third book in your series, the Entram epic, is called Solar War, and it's available now. Can you tell the listeners about the series and Solar War?
So the series is relatively straightforward. It's straight out of the sci-fi playbook in that you're a human and aliens have been discovered. At the beginning of the first book, you know that aliens exist, but there hasn't been any proper physical contact yet. There's been some sort of communications, but it's been difficult to understand what that's meant. And then quite quickly within the first book, then you discover that actually you'd probably rather never have met these aliens, and they're trying to kill you and all your friends, and actually the whole of humanity. And in particular, the way that they do that is they're a symbiotic life form, and so they take humans as hosts, and so you don't quite know who around you ought to be trusting. And so trust no one is the basic principle. And so in the first book, it's called the Ultima, which is the name of the ship that you are on when you discover all of this. The Ultima lands in New Gaia, which is a city on Mars. And so that then moves into the second book. You land in New Gaia in book 1, and then book 2 is called New Gaia because you're in and around the city, meeting important people, trying to figure out who is infested and who isn't, and then ultimately taking down the plot to invade Mars. At the end of book 2, you leave Mars to head back to Earth to discover this new life that you've now able to live, having defeated the aliens. And of course, it turns out that you're taking an alien with you, and you never realized at the time that you set off. And so now you have to defeat the alien threat that exists on Earth, and then you discover that there is an alien invasion coming, and so you have to then essentially lead the entire human fleet from Earth and Mars collectively against the alien force out in the solar system. And so it increases in scale as you go through the whole thing, and has got an ending that I'm really happy with. I'm so satisfied. At the end of each book, it's felt like it's this relatively standard game book end, in that you've kind of gone all the way through, and it's just this sort of, finally, I've got turned to 400 and I'm able to tick the box to say that I've completed it. But there's something that I like about Creature of Havoc is you turn to that final paragraph and you read it and you feel like, that I suddenly, the whole thing now makes sense. I've discovered the truth behind a lot of this mystery that has been there. And the finale of Solar War isn't that sort of discovery of the truth, but it is a discovery of the importance of sacrifice and having achieved this amazing thing. And now what might the future hold for you? It ends on a beautiful note that I'm not going to spoil, but give it a read and find out.
Yeah, so all the way to leading the fleet. Not bad for starting off as a trainee in book one, right?
Oh, so, yeah. And yes, and somebody actually pointed out, well, this is completely unbelievable. I mean, as if the whole thing is not completely unbelievable. They said at the beginning of book one, you're a trainee. And I mean, the nature of it is it only happens over a few days, the whole trilogy. And you've gone from nobody into the savior of the whole of humanity, very public figure. That doesn't make any sense. In game, it does make perfect sense. Each step that you're taking, it has to be you. There's nobody else that could fit the bill. So, yeah, it does make sense.
Meanwhile, superheroes in the Avengers, that makes perfect sense.
Yes, absolutely.
So in the first in the series, the Altimer, that was actually also your first game book. And I'm curious, over the course of writing the series, has your approach to structuring and writing game books changed at all?
I think my ambition has. So the approach to the Altimer, there's a lot about it that I probably, looking back, I would write it very differently now. I'd certainly make it more complex. I wonder if that's good or bad. There are certain things that are very similar in that I do like writing those insta-death paragraphs. And so I get quite a lot of joy out of coming up with different ways that I can, cruelly punish somebody for making a wrong decision, which is often as simple as you turn left instead of right, you fool. But I think I made the Altimer is relatively linear, particularly the opening act of it before you get onto the ship. It felt very important to me that I'd settled the character as somebody who was a trainee going through a training program and getting themselves ready. If I wrote it again now, then I don't think I'd have that at all. I would leap straight into, you've been on your training program and now you're setting off in the ship. And in fact, I thought about, should I do a re-edit that improves on that and accelerates the pace a little bit? And maybe I will one day, but I'm not going to do it quite yet. I think it's quite good in the way that it starts nice and slowly, breaks you in, then it increases in intensity. So reading the trilogy through from beginning to end, you really get a sense of, picking up with the scale and the importance of what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a few episodes before this one, I did a playthrough of your fantasy book, Escape from Portsrood Forest, with my buddy Joe. And now it shouldn't be a spoiler because it's an earlier episode, but he did run into an insta-death for the Instadeath Survivors. It's a fun style of book that you write. Definitely a challenge with a steep penalty.
Yeah, the big difference between Portsrood Forest and the Entram epic isn't so much in the genre, actually. I think my writing is relatively similar if I'm writing fantasy or sci-fi, but they're very different in their style of approach to a branching narrative. So the Entram epic is a story. You're going through, time is passing as you're moving from one step to the next. And so if you miss the choice, you've missed it and you're never getting that chance back. And you may not discover that it's the wrong choice to make until you're closing in on the final sections and it says, do you have this code word? And you go, I don't even know that code word was a choice. And you don't have it. And that means that you haven't completed it. Whereas in Portsrood, time does not exist, basically. You wake up in the morning and you're wandering around the forest and, there is no time at which it says that the sun is going down. You could just wander around indefinitely and you're just stuck in there, which I think is quite nice because it's that enchanted forest, which is slightly different. It doesn't obey the laws of physics in the way that everything else does. But it's a very different approach to writing a game book because we've got this sort of interlocking web of moving around the geography and trying to solve a mystery at the same time.
You say that the writing between Portsrood and the Entram epic is pretty similar, but I think also the setting and the tone is a bit different, right? Like your Entram epic books are a bit dark, right? I don't want to like oversell how dark they are, but there's a dark tone to them. Portsrood Forest has whimsy and humor. Well, at least more whimsy and humor than maybe the Entram epic has, right? I'm curious how that difference in approach and setting and tone all came to be.
Well, the answer to that question is also the answer to the question, why did it take so long between books 2 and 3 in the trilogy? Because books 1 and 2, I mean, I'm not sure what the difference there was, but something like 3 months, I think it was, between book 1 and book 2 coming out. And so my plan for book 3 was give it another quarter. And, my plan is for it to all be finished and I can start on my next project. And that happened at the same time as I was moving house, which is hugely stressful anyway. And literally we moved house on the Friday, and on the Monday, lockdown came into effect in the UK. And so I wasn't allowed to do anything. And so I sort of had this horrible, threat of pandemic and restrictions on movement happening all around me. The idea of then adding into that the seriousness of alien infection moving among the population and threatening the death of humanity just felt like I wasn't in the right space to be doing that properly. And so I just went to a place that I like being. I like being in a forest. I'm fascinated by trees, and I've read a couple of books in the last couple of years that have made me appreciate them even more. And so it just felt like putting something that's a little bit more humorous and is intentionally a bit of fun. It's still got those kind of dark undertones. So that threat is still very much there. Like you say, you walk off the path in the wrong direction. You try to get out of the forest too quickly and it will punish you. Whereas just wandering around the forest aimlessly is quite a pleasant activity, which is not one that was really open to us. And so I think that's where a lot of the difference came from. I needed a bit of that humor to lift me out of it. And then obviously I've managed to go back to Solar War. And so the next project, I don't know which direction it'll go in, but there's a couple of directions open. So we'll see.
That's cool. So, readers often will play game books as a form of escapism. It sounds like writing Portsrood was your way of escaping into a more whimsical place and setting. So another noticeable difference between Escape from Portsrood Forest and the Entram epic is the genders and ethnicities of the characters in the books. What are those differences and why the contrast?
In 2021, that sounds like a political question, doesn't it? I think it's all down to setting, really. So Escape from Portsrood Forest is intentionally written in a sort of medieval fantasy world in which everybody is white, because why wouldn't they be? It's in England, basically. I mean, I know it isn't, but it basically is. And most of the heroes in it, and in fact most of the villains, happen to be men. That there are, there's a beautiful young woman that you encounter, because there are those in medieval fantasy, and there's an old crone, because if you don't have one of those, then you haven't done it properly. But generally, it's very high fantasy traditional. Whereas in the Entram epic, the setting is one in which climate change has been happening, and then in particular, there's a particular event which has led the whole of the Northern Hemisphere essentially to get into a new ice age. And so that's moved all of Europe, North America, Russia down towards the equator. And so there hasn't particularly been a population problem, but there is a concentration of lots of different people around the equator in a new temperate zone, essentially across Africa and around the equator. And so what that means is, if I'm writing this in the way that I need to stay true to that world, there needs to be a mix of ethnicities. And because of technological advancements, which I don't really go into much detail in the book, but I had in-game reasons for doing it. It also means that there's quite a balance of genders. And in fact, by the time that you get into the third book, the three main characters that you're operating in a little group with all happen to be women. And so you've got Pauline, who's the entitled white woman who just went her whole life expecting to be an astronaut, and of course was able to because her parents lined it all up for her. There's Catalina, the sort of playful Hispanic member of the team who's your constant companion right from the beginning. And then there's Jemima, who's a new character in Solar War, who's a South Asian, very moody member of the Martian military based on Earth, who picks up the role basically that Major David Abofanwe had in New Gaia, where he was the representative for the military over there. And so you've got these very strong women around you, and their gender is actually not particularly important. I think I originally wrote Pauline as a man, and just happened to turn into a woman. I'm not sure exactly. I think Paul turned into Pauline, so there you go. It probably quite obviously was a man. But yeah, so I don't particularly think that much about it, to be honest. But it's obviously happened, so everything happens for a reason.
Yeah. Well, so I want to take a left turn for a second, and we'll come back to your work as a game book author. But there's some interesting aspects to your career as an executive coach that I'd like to dig into that might possibly turn out to be enlightening about your approach to game books. So let's see. So firstly, I noticed that you utilize virtual reality in your coaching approach. How did that come about?
That's my claim to fame, actually. So I'm from the first coach in the world to use virtual reality and deliver coaching in that space. I think I'm still the only one. So it's not like I've set a new trend, but it is on my CV. Where that started is towards the beginning of 2020, I got contacted by a university press in Britain to ask me to write a book about coaching with technology, which makes sense because I'm an executive coach now and my background is in technology. And so it was a great opportunity. I had to take them up on that opportunity, which meant I then had to do some research around it. And a topic that came up was virtual reality. It's a new emerging, it's been around for a while, hasn't it? But in terms of mainstream, it's an emerging communications technology. And coaching is all about communication, basically. It's just a conversation. So it felt important to me that I would write about virtual reality. So I asked around every coach that I know, and I know quite a lot, to say, does anybody know anyone who is coaching in virtual reality so that I can interview them for this book? Mm-hmm. And nobody knew anyone. And so I was quite disappointed, but felt like I need to write about it. I need to be informed, so I'll give it a go. And it turned out that a lot of people were very interested in it. And so, I've kind of kept that going. It's a lot of fun, actually.
Great. And actually that book is in progress and it's going to come out through a traditional publishing model. And I'm curious, approaching publishing a book through traditional publishing as opposed to self-publishing with your game books. Have you learned anything from that process that might change your approach to self-publishing or writing and marketing game books?
They are slightly different experiences. One experience that is very different and I don't like is that the traditional publishing model is very slow. Mm-hmm. So I finished writing the book. I finished writing it before Christmas. That was my deadline. And a relatively self-imposed deadline, but it was, I'd committed to them. I'm going to get it in before Christmas. And it isn't getting published until August. So in between then and August, you've got 3 different rounds of editing plus proofreading and typesetting and formatting and cover design and all of these different bits. And so that delay, particularly when you're writing about technology in the change pace that we're currently living in, just seems like it's too long. And I'm used to self-publishing where I finish writing a book and once I'm finished, I can just click publish whenever I like. Mm-hmm. And so I think I probably need to learn some patience. That's probably a good thing to take out of it. But I prefer there being a bit of pace around it so that when I'm releasing the book, I'm still excited about it. And the truth is that I finished writing this nonfiction book several months ago, so I've forgotten a lot of what I've written. So by the time that it comes to publication, I'll have to read my own book again just to remind myself what I think. And then I'll probably discover I disagree with myself, which would be odd. There are positives about it, though. So the fact that I was writing for somebody else did make me focus on quality a huge amount more. So I read my own book through more times than I can count. Whereas with the game books, I'm quite impatient. And so that's why I really value the playtesters. So every one of my books has got a list of people that have playtested it at the beginning, because I think if I don't have somebody else coming and checking it, I'm going to be my own worst enemy and I'm just going to hit publish too soon. And in fact, Portsrood Forest, oh my goodness, that went through so much change between me sharing it with playtesters and it actually, hitting the bookshelves. Victoria Hancock's actually, she was one of the playtesters for it. And by the time that it came out and she read it, she was like, this is a completely different book. I actually like it this time. So
that's funny.
Yeah, no, it is interesting. They are different. But the writing process is identical, though. I don't know why I thought that would be different.
You also say that you draw from ancient wisdom literature in your coaching. Can you tell me about that?
I was thinking about this morning. What on earth would I be doing about this in game books? Because I'd picked up the book of Proverbs, which is in the Bible. So that's been around for thousands of years. And it feels like there's just a huge amount of depth in there. So it's a series of couplets, basically, that don't do this, but do this instead. Or if you do this, this thing's going to happen. And if you do this other thing, then the same thing might happen, ? It just makes you think. And I wondered, could I write a game book just basically that takes you through the Proverbs one at a time? And I immediately told myself that's a stupid idea. Don't you dare do that. But now I've said it. You never know. Never close it down. So, so in my coaching, I'll just take that and position it as just something for contemplation and just kind of see where it takes the conversation. Because I think if something's been around for that long and is still getting read, every day, that means there's something in it. Yeah, it means something. The story of Adam and Eve. My nonfiction book, I start with the story of Adam and Eve because, again, that story has been around for so long. There's some real truth that's in it, and I wonder if should I take a game book that basically takes some arc like that and replicates it, but in a game book format. Mm-hmm. So if you go down the route and actually you don't listen to the serpent, as much as it seems sensible, you're actually not going to get to the right outcome at the end because that's the one that's intended. So, I'm very intrigued by that.
I was thinking, I wondered if perhaps the character attributes in the Entram epic series might have been inspired by that focus on spiritual intelligence in your coaching. Maybe before we even really talk about that, just could you tell the listeners what those character scores are in the Entram epic?
Yeah. So I'd basically wanted something that was straightforward enough to use, but was a little bit more meaningful than, not to downplay it, but, skill, stamina, luck, which felt like it was heavily focused around combat. And I wanted a system that was more focused around you're a human being. Mm-hmm. And so I went through down the route of multiple intelligences. So I think it was Stephen Covey that came up with this little model first. I mean, why not? He does everything else, doesn't he? So I'll say it was him. And so the four names that I came up with was mind, body, heart, and spirit. And so the mind is your cognitive abilities, your body is your physical abilities, your heart is your social and emotional intelligence, and then your spirit is basically your ability to keep going. And so it is representing your hit points, and also it's got a psychological element in there. So actually you can be psyched out and your spirit drops as a result of that. Mm-hmm. I wasn't particularly thinking about spirituality as a result of it, although the word's obviously there. It just felt like mind, body, heart, spirit sits nicely together.
Great. I was going to ask you actually about the combat systems in your sci-fi books. You've got sort of skill checks as well as, traditional combat. But actually the combat, that sort of breaks your spirit, so to speak. Right. And that's so like spirit sort of represents more than just sort of death. Right. Can you tell me about that? Like what spirit going to zero represents in your books?
Well, the spirit reaching zero just represents that you've lost the ability to keep going. So, I mean, it could mean death. It essentially does mean that. But there are times in which you're going to lose spirit because you're becoming disheartened. Mm-hmm. And actually, if you're feeling really bad, you've taken so many wounds that you're, essentially just dragging yourself from one room on the ship to the next, and then something happens that just makes you go, I've lost a teammate. And so you might lose some spirit because you've lost a teammate. Well, actually, that means that, you've just lost your ability to keep going. And so it's a psychological impact of it. But the rest of the universe is still moving on with or without you. And so that means that you're never going to complete your adventure. And I wanted something that was a bit broader than just combat. And I wanted it to make clear to people that the route to succeeding isn't necessarily just going to be a murder hobo. And so I made combat intentionally absolutely brutal. And so almost regardless of what your body score is, there are certain tests that rely on your body score. Jumping over a high wall or something, you need yet to have a good enough high body score. But in combat, it's basically down to the luck of the dice. So if you get a high number when you roll your 2 dice and add it onto your body, you take off the opponent's body, and then that's the damage you've done to their spirit. So if you roll a 12, add it onto your body of 4, and they've got a body of 7, you're still doing 9 damage, which is going to kill most enemies that you encounter. You always get the first hit. I'm always going to give you, the reader, the benefit of the doubt, but it does mean if you don't roll well on that first one, it's quite likely you're going to die in the second hit.
All of this talk about combat systems and stats and murder hobos, it makes me think of tabletop role-playing games, of course, which do seem to be a kind of a cousin to game books. Have you been influenced at all by role-playing games?
Well, yeah, I have. I'm part of a local role-playing game group. I mean, I say that. I haven't connected with them since before the beginning of lockdown, really, because I've found it very hard to do that online. I really like the social interaction that comes with it physically. I don't really appreciate that as much virtually. But I do play a number of different role-playing games. And as I know that Dungeons and Dragons gets a lot of attention. That isn't the first one that I tend to go to. I tend to prefer systems that have much fewer mechanics associated with it and are a lot more heavy on the narrative. There's one particular game, The Genesis, which is based in a post-apocalyptic world in which the polar ice caps have come down, and there's been an event that's led that to happen. And so I drew on that quite heavily for the setting of the Ultima and etc. But yeah, I do like role-playing games. I like the collaborative fiction that's happening there.
Yes, speaking of collaboration, with game books in particular, what do you think the role is of the author versus the reader in a game book?
So I think there are essentially 3 different ways that people write game books. And obviously that's then how they're received. So you've got the world in which, as I've done essentially with the Entram epic, it's basically a huge narrative puzzle for you to solve as the reader. So if you know which decisions are the right ones to take, you'll be able to make it through from the beginning to the end. And you might need a bit of luck with the dice, or you might just cheat your way through it. I don't really mind. But as long as you make the right choices, you're going to be able to tell that story. And if you go off the track, you're not going to be able to solve the story, and so you get it wrong. Another way is that this is actually meant to be a collaborative world that the reader and the writer are building together. And so it isn't actually my story, it's our story. And so I'm going to provide the setting and you make the choices, and then we'll see what consequences there are, and we'll extrapolate it out from there and see what the ending's going to be. I quite like the idea of that, but I haven't written in that way. And then the third way is that it's a simulation of an environment. And so I'm going to create a mechanic system that works, and I'm going to create a world that's allowing you to then travel from one place to the next and sort of see what happens. And you can travel there as a character of your choosing and simulate what the effects of that would be. And so there's an element of that, I think, in Portsrood Forest in particular, where you could just wander around aimlessly and just stumble across things as you're going. And so it's meant to be a bit of a simulation of being in a forest with that having happened to you. But I haven't done that to its fullest extent. And there are no mechanics in Portsrood Forest, so I think that's quite important.
I'm curious, do you have examples of books that have done like each of those 3? Well, I was about to say have done them well, but let's just do it that have done those, just for the listeners who might be interested in like trying each of those types of things. I
mean, I think a lot of the fighting fantasy, and not just fighting fantasy, but loads of others, Blood Sword, and I mean, we could just go on listing and missing ones that we ought to include. I think a lot of game books do go down the narrative puzzle road. And they're much easier to design, so I'm not surprised. I think the simulation ones, Fabled Lands is probably the closest that there is, and I think it does it very well. Mm-hmm. One of the biggest criticisms that Fabled Lands get is there isn't an objective. I want to start the book and I want you to tell me what it is that I'm meant to do, and it's designed to not do that. It's designed to just drop you in, and if you just want to become a trader, which is what I spent when I was a teenager, what I basically did was buy a ship and travel from port to port trying to make profit. You're able to do that. And so I think it does that sort of simulated world quite well. So the best example of the collaborative storytelling approach would probably be in some of the choose your own adventure versions, where you've got 29 different endings that you could find, and that's going to depend on the choices that you've made. And so actually it's a different story every time that you've read it. And so I think each approach, one of the advantages of game books is its replayability. And one of the comments, it's interesting, one of the comments that I got off the Entram epic is it's so highly replayable because it's so difficult to get it right first time, which makes me go, I wonder how that actually works. Because the way that I tend to approach those books is I read until I make a mistake, and then immediately, obviously, I keep my fingers in place with all the decisions that I've made and just flick back to whichever decision I made wrong and, go back and rework it. Whereas I think there's a huge amount of replayability in Fabled Lands. You just pick a different character and start from the start again, and it's a different experience because you're now a different character doing different things. And the sort of collaborative fiction model, it means that in any read-through, you're only going to be reading a tiny portion of the whole book. And so you could read it 10 times and each time have an entirely different experience. So I might do that one day.
Very cool. Speaking of things we might do one day, do you have any big sort of innovative ideas on the back burner that you'd like to see either yourself or some author explore that hasn't been done in game books yet?
That's a good question, because it needs me to come up with something that other people haven't done. I've got a long list of ideas. I'm currently playing with another story told in the Portsrood world and in the Portsrood style. So this time you'll be locked inside a city and there have been a murder and you've got to solve the murder. And I'm struggling to work out how it's going to be very cruel to you as a reader, and that feels important to me. So I'm not sure if that one will ever see the light of day. We'll see. And like I say, I think a Western one, there are some genres that just haven't particularly been touched. It seems quite exciting to me that there are a lot of interactive fiction, particularly mobile apps, coming out in the romance genre, which makes me feel like that's not something that was done in fighting fantasy, obviously. And, could we actually challenge ourselves to think a little bit further outside the box? It doesn't have to be part of nerd culture. It could be something that's a little bit different. And I'm interested around mechanics. I'm wondering if there's going to be a bit of a crossover between digital and analog. I think there's a lot of people that like mobile apps, and that's obviously where the whole of society has gone to. But I think there's a real preference for analog among some people, and it's increasing. And so the pleasure of a book that you're flicking around from page to page does make a difference. But I wonder if the mechanics work better when it's slightly behind the scenes. And so could there be a bit of a crossover, maybe some sort of augmented reality that could make that work? So, yeah, I'm happy to be surprised. And I quite like sort of stretching things. And so if somebody has got some good ideas and would like to try it out with somebody, then, give me a call. Why not? Try and make it work.
Very cool. And we also talked a bit already about like how brutal your books can be in terms of having lots of ways to lose and really only one way to win. It seems like you're not particularly bothered by readers, quote unquote cheating in your books. Is that almost an expectation you have as an author that people are going to cheat their way through it?
Well, yeah, it is. I do expect people to cheat because it's what I do. I remember as a teenager playing fighting fantasy, and Fabled Lands as well. They were the big ones for me, where I would lie in my bed rolling the dice, and if it didn't give me the number I'd like, I'd roll them again. And it's not that I was just going to cheat my way through. I was going to see that number rolls that I wanted, but I'd roll it as many times as I needed to get there. And so I sort of expected that. So one of the comments that I got on Solar War from a playtester was, I worked this out. There's a moment where you're trying to hack into a computer system. And at this point in the book, you're something like 300 years in the future from now. So I'm thinking encryption's going to be high. It's going to be difficult to hack. And so I'd set the difficulty level reasonably high. And he said, there's only a 20% chance that somebody on average stats is going to be able to get this successfully. And they need to do this to complete it. So you should make it easier. And I thought, 20% on somebody on average stats? Well, I need to make it harder. There's no way that it's going to be like that. And so I think that there's a little bit of I want it to feel like it's a real challenge. And I also expect somebody that if they go through and then they fail it and it says you've been discovered and so now you die, that you'll then go back and award yourself having done it successfully on this time that you read it through, because otherwise you're not getting the right story. So I definitely do expect people to cheat. Having said that, I do build in some very horrible anti-cheating mechanisms that this is quite unfair, really. In New Gaia, at one point, there's a particular weapon that you need to have picked up in order to take down the surgeon, who is the sort of halfway point boss before you go on to the big bad. And if you haven't picked up this weapon, you're still given the chance to go through a little conversation with her and then get challenged by her and enter into hand-to-hand combat with her. So at this point, I know that you're not going to win, but I'm still going to let you play it out. And then you go into hand-to-hand combat, and her stats are so high that it is mathematically impossible for you to win. But I expect you to cheat. And so there's still an option at the end of the section that says, if you win, turn to this section. And when you turn there, it's an insta-death paragraph. So despite the fact that you may have pretended to roll your way through this battle and then told me that you've won, you clearly haven't. And so, I do build in things like hidden sections and that sort of thing, so that at some point you do have to actually solve the problem yourself.
Yeah, there's like a mechanism that I didn't even realize was a mechanism until it happened to me in one of Victoria Hancock's books, which was, there's a point at which she clearly knows you're going to die, and then you go through the motions of several sections down a path, and what that means is you've just lost any hope of having a finger bookmark type situation, and you're like, no. It sounds like you do something similar in New Gaia, right? Like you're definitely going to lose, right? But anyway, cool. Well, it's been great talking with you, Sam. Before we go, what's the best place for a listener to start with your work, and where can they go to get it?
Everything is available on Amazon, so it's nice and simple. I think Portsrood Forest and the Entram Epic have two different feels, and so if you want something that is fantasy and is a bit whimsical, don't pick up the Entram Epic. It's not going to give that to you. And I think Solar War, I think, is definitely the best of the three. And so if you just want a one-off, it's got all of the spoilers are in the background, so it tells you everything that's happened up to that point. But if you just want to pick up one, why not pick up that one? And then if you really do like it, go back and try playing the others, which I know I shouldn't say. I should say, go pick up the first and see if you want to buy the other two. That's not very commercial of me, is it? Buy them all. But yeah, Portsrood and Solar War.
Excellent. Well, thanks again for coming on the show.
It's lovely to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for supporting the show. If you'd like to help even more, rate and review Instadeath Survivors Support Group anywhere you listen to podcasts. A special thanks to our guests and to the contributors who help make the show better than I ever could on my own. Intro music graciously provided by Jesse Johnson, aka Zenoda. Find more great music by searching Jesse Johnson or Zenoda, spelled with an X, on YouTube and most major streaming platforms. Podcast cover art generously contributed by Patrick O'Neill. You can learn more about Pat's art on his Facebook page, Pat O'Neill Art.